So editing on the timeline down here, clips of footage is one thing. But if you recall, we looked at a couple of other, we're working with this standard or basic workspace starter, but we added a couple of panels. We added an effects controls panel, which basically gives us access to the parameters of the object that we're working with, and we can animate those parameters. So if I select this piece of footage, for instance, in my effect controls, you'll see that I've got different categories for motion, which gives my position and scale, rotation, the anchor point. Under opacity, I can adjust the opacity of the image or the video, and audio volume. So we're not going to mess with the audio right now because it really doesn't have anything decent in it. But I do want to look at some of these properties. And the easiest way to do that, I think, is if I also go in and grab this bit of footage. And this is only a photo. So I'm just going to drop this in. That's pretty wild. That's new, yeah. I'm using the starter workspace, but I have added, so once you select the starter workspace, I have added, if you go up to window, I added effect controls as well as essential graphics to it. And I put my effect controls over here on the left-hand side. I just find it easier, makes more sense for me over there. So I'm just going to drag this footage clip down here onto my sequence above my space footage. And there's my starship, but it's way too big. So if I select that and go under my effect controls, I'm going to start with scale. So if I turn down that little arrow next to it, I can do one of two things. Right here it says that it's currently at 100%. I can click on that and drag to the left or the right and change the scale. So I can sort of resize manually that way. I can also use this slider that comes along with it. So I'm just going to sort of scale that down to about that. And then use my selection tool, and I should be able to grab it, double click on it, and I can slide it up a little bit in my workspace as well if I want to. So when I position stuff, if I double click on it, I can drag it around. I've got handlebars to work with, but I can also move this stuff around. Just like I did scale, I can move its position up and down over here with the numbers, or left and right. So I'm just going to kind of put it there and slide it up a little bit. So this worked out well. I had a photo that I outlined and I brought in as it's just a static image asset. It doesn't actually, it's not a video at all, but we're going to do some things to it. That doesn't mean that it can't move and that kind of thing. So I've got him positioned where I want him, and sort of where I want him. Let's do that. So anything I do, I'm going to do over time. So I'm going to slide, actually, I'm going to leave this right about here. So this starts at, if I look at where my playhead is, I'm at about 1.5 seconds in. So that's where this guy's going to start. And I actually want to fly him onto screen. And I can do this by simply animating the position points. And the way I do that is this. So if I select this guy, and let's say that I'm looking here at about 3 seconds, I want him to be on screen. I can go up here to my position option in my layer effect controls, and there's this little stopwatch right next to it. That's anything that has that stopwatch basically means you can animate it. And you start animating it by clicking on the stopwatch. So this is where I want it to start, and I'm going to animate backwards, actually. So I'm going to start by clicking on the stopwatch, and you'll see that out here next to it, it drops a little diamond. So what we're looking at is, this is my timeline down here, but up here in my effect controls, this is a representation of my timeline as well. So wherever my playhead is, the playhead up here will match up. So I've basically said that at this point in time, this is where I want this object to be. And if I want to animate it, all I need to decide now is, okay, in what point in time do I want it to be somewhere else? So and I'm going to do this backwards because I know this is where I want it to end up. So I'm just going to slide back in time a little bit. And see, when I slide this playhead, this one goes as well. So I'm just going to slide back to about here and decide that I'm going to double click on this guy again, and I'm going to slide him back here off the screen. And you see when I did that, it drops another diamond out here next to my position. So if I pull this open and I'm going to drop this to like 100, oops, not 100, 50, so I can see what I got. Now, if I slide my timeline across or play, you'll see that my spaceship comes into the screen. So I start back here, move my playhead back to the very beginning, tap the space bar, and here comes my spaceship. If you did that much, congratulations. That's our first animated object. So, I mean, editing video together is one thing, but actually animating stuff on screen, like static images like this, or type, shapes, any number of other things, is something else. So, and we can do both in both Premiere and After Effects. So we have effectively animated the ship coming on. One of the things I think is that, if we play that through, kind of comes on and it's great. It moves, but it's not real exciting. Probably need to vary the size of it as well. I think it would be better if, based upon the perspective of the ship, it probably actually needs to fly towards us from the left. So I'm going to put my playhead back directly where my last position keyframe is. And if I zoom in here, this little bar at the bottom, I can kind of zoom in on this a little bit more. Position that. So I'm right here where this last keyframe is. And I'm going to go down to my scale property, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to click on scale to set my first keyframe. And then I'm going to come over here to where this starts. And I'm going to set my second keyframe, but I'm going to drop the scale quite a bit. And I'm going to drop it down to actually I'm going to click on the numbers and type a 5 in there. I'll make it 5%. So now when I scrub across from here to here, 5% wasn't enough, I don't think. So I'm going to go back, put my playhead right on top of those keyframes again, and I'm going to drop from 5 down to 0. We'll just make it not exist where it starts, so that when I scroll across, there we go. It's smaller, but it gets bigger as it comes towards us. The thing to remember about animation is that all animation is a lot of visual sleight of hand, by and large. We're just faking things. So we're not working in a 3D space. So in this particular instance, we're going to fake the fact that we actually want it to appear as though the ship is way far away from us and, comes towards us. We're going to do that by adjusting scale. Further things are away, the smaller they are, the closer they are to us, the bigger they are, right? So I think animation tends to confuse a lot of people and for a lot of different reasons at different points. But always try to remember that all you're ever really trying to do is say, at this point in time, I want you to think that this object is here or doing this particular thing. And at this point in time, I want you to think something else about it. And here's what I want you to think. And you're animating between those 2 points in time. You're setting its state at one, changing its state at the other. So, this actually works out fairly well to give us that sense that the ship is flying towards us. Maybe it'd be a little more realistic if it wasn't entirely off screen. I could come back over here, put my playhead right on the start point. Maybe I change its X position. Maybe I move it to actually be on screen. So let's see. Maybe I slide that X position back a little bit. Let's try that. Because remember, my scale is 0, so it's not going to appear anyway. So now if I play it, still a little funky, but it could use some more work, but that's not terrible. Oops. So here's the other thing people do, and I'm reminded of it because I just did it. What matters is where this playhead is on your timeline. Whatever change you make, wherever that playhead is, it's going to drop a new keyframe. So if I'm playing my way through here and I decide, you know what, it really needs to be bigger out, if I'm playing this through and it's like, the ship needs to be bigger here, but my playhead's actually back here, or my playhead is actually over here, even worse, and I go ahead and I make this bigger, it drops another keyframe. So now, this isn't really what I wanted it to do. It flies over to here, and then all of a sudden it gets really big, because that's what I told it to do, because I wasn't paying attention really to where my playhead was. So I can always move these keyframes around. So if I went and did something like that, I could delete this keyframe that's right here, and I can always select this keyframe and slide it over. And this is kind of the second thing to learn about animation. A lot of times it doesn't matter where we place our keyframes initially, we place them to sort of set something up. But we can always move them around by simply clicking on them and moving them. So if I slide this in, you see that it's going to reach scale far sooner than it actually reaches its position. So I can speed this all up by moving my keyframes closer together. And that's actually way too big, so we're going to scale that back down again. But you get the idea. We set these keyframes and then we move them around. So I did it with static type, or with a static image. I can do the same thing with type. So if I go down here to my timeline and select my type tool, I can come up here, click with my type tool, and it's going to place a type graphic on my timeline again. And this is NCC 1701. And we'll just leave that type as it is for right now. But if you've got the Essential Graphics panel up, we can change the font here based upon whatever we happen to have open. This is actually VO, I actually like. This typeface for this. So we can set type, and we can scale that up some. I can click and pull it down. I'm going to place it right there. And decide that, well, once my ship gets in, my ship comes in, sits there, and I'm just going to slide that type over on my timeline. And the same way I change position and scale for my ship, I'm going to change opacity for my type. So let's come up here under there's my type object, under my effect controls. If I go down to opacity, I can set a keyframe right at the very beginning and drop that down to 0. And then move ahead a little bit. Doesn't really matter where. And actually that places that keyframe right on the very edge. You can kind of barely see it. If I click on it, I can drag it out a little bit. So I'll just come over to about here. And I'm going to decide that I want that to be 100% here. So now when I play this through, the ship comes in and my type comes on screen. And they disappeared because each of my clips don't last very long. So I can, because these are static images, static type, static photo, I can come out here to the end of this and stretch this out to match my sequence, match my footage, if that's what I want it to do. So now when I play this, ship comes in, type comes on screen. And if your type seems to come on too fast or seems to come on too slow, we can go back up here to select our type, come back up here, look at our keyframes, and I could delay that a little bit more, or I can make this take longer to come on screen just by moving my keyframes around. And what I kind of encourage you to do is put them together close, play it, see what you get. That's pretty quick. Spread them apart. Move your playhead back. Play that. That takes a little longer to come on. Getting a sense of timing is one of the new things you get to develop now that we're working with motion. The habit tends to be to do things too slowly. Most stuff happens pretty quick. So this is just kind of a, play around with it until it kind of feels right to you, how it comes on. So that does that. I could do something kind of nice. Maybe I can, instead of just fading that on, maybe I'm going to actually shorten that up. Maybe I'll adjust my position as well. I'm going to open the motion. And I think when it's fully on screen, its Y position should be 540 like it is. But I think that when it starts, I want to lower that just a little bit. so that when it comes on screen, actually I raised it instead of lowered it. It kind of drop fades in. It's a little nicer motion than just fading something on screen. Time we got. All right. So those are the basics of keyframing. So I can keyframe this video if we want to. If I select this video and double click on it, it's already the size I want it, but I mean, I could scale it up a little bit if I wanted to, I think. You know, I could scale that a little bit if I wanted. Do any number of things with it. So there we go. And I am gonna, I don't like where my type is. Why is it there? Let's take a look at this again. Put my playhead back right here. Opacity's there. I want to pull my text across to here. There we go. So it's all a little closer together. All right? So we've animated a couple of objects. We can do the same thing. We've got some primitive tools down here. We could draw shapes, you know, animate anything we want. I'm going to leave those two animated items there. So there's one other thing about motion that we always have to deal with. And if we watch this movement, so this comes in, and it really just, it's very linear. It comes in and it stops, and then the type fades on screen kind of nicely, but it can be, there can be more. So this is easier if I explain it this way first. So when we set those keyframes, and whether we're working in Premiere or After Effects, basically what it does is we've got our time, so our timeline, here's 0, 1, 2 seconds. And if our starting position is, if this is time, the coordinates actually live above and below this timeline, all right? So if this, say, are the coordinates of our starting point, and when we move it across, it gets bigger in scale. This is a small size, say 1.5 seconds. This point might represent the change in scale. And what it does is actually draws a line straight between those, which is why when it scales or when it moves and then it stops. Doesn't do anything else, all right? Linear movement is, generally speaking, fairly unnatural, but that's what it does by default. So Premiere and After Effects both have, and actually any animation app, what we want to do is actually ease our motion into these points. So what we don't want is for it to be straight like this. In that particular case, what we would want is for it to come into the screen and then sort of slow in. Imagine a car, you know, whenever you pull up to a stop sign, you don't pull up to a stop sign and just slam on the brakes and stop on a dime, it's you ease into it, right? So what we want is for this line to actually do this, and as we get closer to this point, it evens off. And actually that's a little too much, but we actually kind of want to do that kind of thing. Because what that's going to do is it's going to move a little quicker to a point, but then it's going to slow up because it's closer. You know, if we put a little dot, we're closer and closer to our final position, right? So that's called, so we're always going to either ease into a point or we're going to ease out of a point. So this is what we want to do here is actually ease into a point. And if we want to ease out of this one, put another set here and here. We can always ease out of a point as well and ease into the next one. So it's slow out of the first one, ramps up, and then slow into the second one. And that'd be easy easing. It's an ease in and ease out and ease in combination. So anytime we're talking about easing though, we're always going to ease into or out of a point on our line. We're not easing into the motion. We're not easing into or out of a motion. We're easing into the points. All right? Which, if you can think about easing into the point, I think it makes the most sense. So that matters because if we look at our timeline here, if I right click, I'm going to select that point, right click on it. In our contextual menu here, we've got a temporal interpolation. I don't know who picked that phrase. It's kind of goofy, but linear is what it is by default. We're going to come down here and I want to ease into that point. And you see it changes that icon, that little diamond. And I'm also going to do the same thing to my scale. I'm going to ease into that scale point. So now, and that was actually, let's do it to a ship. The ship is going to be an easier thing to see. So I want to zoom into this line. Slide over here. So it's actually position and scale here that I actually want to ease into on the spaceship. And I can select them both at the same time. And ease into those points. So they both change. So now if I play that across, so that was a little better. It didn't come to the hard stop that it normally does. It comes into a little easier. It's subtle, but it's a little bit easier. It's not quite as abrupt. It's still not really enough, but we can control how much it eases. So so next to my position and scale, there's this little arrow next to each of them. If I turn those down, here's that curve I just drew up on the board. And all I need to do is, like on my position, I'll start with it. I'm just going to click on the handlebar and drag it out some. And I'm going to come down here to my scale, and I'm going to do the same thing. So now when I play these back, well, that was nicer, but I got a little bit I might have gone too far. Kind of got big and then settled back. Oh, it did because I see why it did. There we go. So that eases in a lot nicer. At least it's not as abrupt as it was. Sort of slows into its final stop. And that can use a lot of refinement. I mean, I could, if I thought it helped, I could bring it, I could do it with another keyframe in between so that it comes really quickly into a certain point, but then it slows down and comes the rest of the way. I could try to control it that way. You know, there's any number of things you can try. But easing is one of those things that we need to do with almost everything we animate and keyframe that way. It just gives a much more refined look, feel to things. Maybe I shouldn't have easy eased my scale at all. I could take that back to linear, see what that does. Yeah. And that's kind of the weird thing about easing is that even that change, I removed the easing from my scale, but because my ship gets closer to its destination faster and then slows down, it actually changes the way this looks when it comes in. It almost looks like it makes a turn and comes towards us. And that's just that sort of illusion of the speed at which it gets to that final point. So these are all things that, as we work with animation, you're just going to kind of get a feel for and kind of figure out. I mean, you can watch all the tutorials that tell you what to do and listen to everybody you want to listen to, but at some point, there's just this understanding that kind of develops as to how things interact with each other and how to get things to do what you want them to do. So that, maybe I'll go back to easing that into that point. Do that. So, those are kinds of the basics of animation. Every single thing that has a stopwatch next to it you can animate, which means almost everything in any of these programs you can animate, whether it's effects, transitions like this. I mean, these are simple property animations, but you can do pretty much anything you need to do with all these controls. Yeah, needs work, but you get the idea. So, keyframing, here's an important thing to remember as well. Once you've clicked on this stopwatch, if you click on it again, it'll erase all your keyframes. At least Premiere gives you a warning when you do that. After Effects does not. So I don't know why that's so hard for them, but you do at least get a warning. So no, I don't actually want to do that. But if you need to erase all the keyframes in a line, that's the easy, quick way to do it. Say you got them all set up and it's just they're a mess and you're not sure what they're doing, you just want to start it over. That's the best way to do it. Some other things we can animate here just real quick. Every object that you animate will have a, I'll zoom in on this real quick. Every object you animate will have a center point. Whether it's type, whether it's an image, whether it's a video, doesn't really matter. In this case, it always sits right in the middle of the frame. So this is light blue. You can kind of barely see it right here, all right? You can click on that center point and move it if you want. Anytime you animate a scale or a position, it's always going to animate from that spot. So if I don't want it to animate from there, say I've got something that I actually want it to animate from out here. If I move that point and adjust my scale, see, now it's scaling out from the end of that object. This is a good, handy kind of thing to know later on. Right now, keeping it in the middle is fine, but any transform will always happen around that point, wherever you've got it placed. So, and if I right click on this, I can, where's it at here? There should be an easy way to recenter that. I'm not sure I know where it's at in Premiere. I'll have to look that up, because I don't do this kind of animation in Premiere very often. If I'm going to do this kind of animation, I make a dynamic link to After Effects and I do it there. But I'll find it later. There should be a way for me to. There should be an easy way for me to recenter that center point to the object. So, but just know that you can animate. You can also move that anchor point by adjusting its coordinates down here as well. It's just whenever you adjust this from the effect controls, it actually moves the entire, it leaves the center point where it's at and it moves the object. So they kind of behave a little differently. But just things to get used to more than anything else. Anchor point rotation does what you think it would do. Rotate it. So. But that's keyframe animation. Basically, you're just animating from point A to point B, and then you make adjustments to your timing on stuff, you know, as you need to. As we get into more advanced animation, we're going to mess around with our keyframes, offsetting them and whatnot. One sure way to kind of keep things looking, no matter what kind of easing you do and that kind of thing, one way to keep things looking relatively stale is by having things happen and always at exactly the same time. So if we can do things like maybe our position, don't reach our final position until just a little bit later. Actually, that wasn't what I wanted at all, but I've added a new keyframe. I added because I moved my anchor point, I kind of messed this guy up. That's what happened. But I can fix that by getting rid of that keyframe and sliding this back over. So my scale comes in sooner than my final position. That kind of changes the feel of that a little bit. There we go. That's a little better. I could adjust that. So those are kind of the basics of keyframe animation. And that's probably, I'm trying to think if there's anything else that makes sense with that, covering of this. Yeah. So, two different ways we can animate out of Premiere. I kind of think that's enough to go over. So what I'm going to want to do, actually, I think on Tuesday,